Um, Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I want you to imagine, just for a second, spending 10,000 hours mastering a physical skill.
Oh yeah, the classic 10,000 hours rule.
Right. Think about callousing your hands, memorizing every single tactical maneuver, sacrificing your sleep.
Pushing your body to its absolute breaking point, just to become the very best at what you do.
Yeah, and you finally reach the pinnacle of your field. But then, imagine realizing that you did not actually do any of it.
That is a staggering thought.
It really is. Like every ounce of that capability, every twitch of muscle memory, every brilliant deduction, none of it actually originated with you.
It completely shatters the illusion of the self-made man, does it not?
Oh, totally. Today on our deep dive, we are looking at a worldview that completely dismantles that assumption of human ownership over human skill.
Yeah, we're examining a remarkable exposition by Charles Spurgeon from his work on the Treasury of David.
Right, specifically focusing on Psalm 144. Our mission today is to take you through the progression of this text.
We are looking at a new song of David that begins in the intense, visceral reality of spiritual warfare.
It shifts into a striking reflection on the absolute vapor of human existence, calls down the actual artillery of heaven, and then finishes with a stunning, holistic picture of a blessed society.
It is quite an arc.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this. We begin right at the opening verse where David says, "Blessed be the Lord my strength, which teacheth my hands to war and my fingers to fight."
It is a heavy way to open because we have to recognize immediately that David is not dealing in theological abstractions here.
Right, he was a literal warrior.
Exactly. His daily existence involved camps, caves, blood, and literal battlefields.
Yeah, but his first instinct is not to credit his own generalship.
No, not at all. He refuses to praise his tactical brilliance. He points to God as the active, sovereign agent in all human success.
And the Hebrew text uses a really fascinating concept right out of the gate. When David says, "The Lord my strength," the literal Hebrew reads, "my rock."
Yes. In that ancient language and geographical context, a rock is the supreme symbol of absolute, unyielding security.
It implies a firm base that cannot be moved, something that exists entirely outside of our frail, fluctuating human frame.
That distinction between the frail human frame and the unyielding rock is crucial.
But, the verse actually goes even further than just calling God a stationary rock. It says God actually teaches his hands and his fingers to fight.
Which is incredibly practical. We often think of divine instruction as something purely ethereal, right?
Yeah, we picture a quiet room, an enlightened thought, maybe a gentle whisper in the mind.
But David is talking about literal muscle memory. He's talking about the physical deftness of the fingers needed to draw back a heavy bowstring.
Or to properly grip a massive shield in hand-to-hand combat.
Right, and the source text brings up a fascinating parallel here. Spurgeon compares this to how God taught the ancient artisans who worked in brass for the tabernacle.
Yeah, I love that part. God did not just give them the blueprint, he gave them the physical dexterity.
Yes, the actual neural pathways to execute the design. It forces you to realize that every single ounce of human capability comes directly from the Creator.
That physical reality illustrates a much larger theological truth about human inability.
Absolutely. If even the raw physical skill to pull a bowstring or hammer a piece of brass is a direct gift of divine grace, how much more is our spiritual survival completely dependent on God?
Because untrained force is a massive liability.
Oh, for sure. If a person has raw might but lacks the divine instruction on how to wield it, they will only cause devastation to themselves and to others.
So David recognizes that the sovereign God must train the smallest, most minute members of our frame. Even the fingers need divine instruction.
And because of this utter dependence, David proceeds in the second verse to multiply his descriptions of God.
Yeah, he lists them out. He calls God his goodness, which can also be translated as mercy, his fortress, his high tower, his deliverer, and his shield.
The multiplication of those terms is so striking. It feels like David cannot find a single human concept large enough to contain the reality of what God is doing for him.
He really can't. But there's a historical analogy from the source material by Catherine Pennefather that I want to bring in here.
Oh, that is a great one.
Yeah, because it provides some serious friction for how we process this kind of divine strength. She compares receiving God's grace to depositing money into a bank account.
And then never actually spending a dime of it.
Right. She observes that we are constantly asking God for strength, pleading for help, but then we just hoard the grace. We refuse to actually put our hands to war.
Which is a common pitfall.
I have to admit, I struggle with this idea myself. Why do we do that? Why do you think a person would beg for divine instruction and strength, but then sit back in total passivity, as if the Christian life requires zero exertion?
Well, the reason we hoard that grace often stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of how the covenant operates.
Okay, unpack that.
God's absolute sovereignty over our actions does not negate the necessity of those actions. Rather, his sovereignty is the very mechanism that makes our action possible.
So when God provides the strength, he provides it for a specific grueling purpose.
Right. The believer is expected to actually fight. The passivity Pennefather critiques is usually born of fear.
Because we know instinctively that our own faith shakes at the slightest pressure.
Exactly. That is precisely why David needs all those multiplied metaphors. When our faith wavers, a simple shield might not feel like enough.
We need to know God is also an inaccessible fortress.
I am glad you brought up the fortress metaphor, because Spurgeon details the geographical reality behind that word, and it changes the way you read the verse.
It really does. When David says fortress, he is likely thinking of physical locations like Masada.
Right. For you listening, Masada is this massive, isolated rock plateau in the Judean desert.
It rises over 1,000 feet in the air with sheer cliff drops on every single side.
Or, you could picture the Heidelberg Castle in Europe positioned high above the valley.
These were places that were entirely inaccessible to an invading army. You could not scale the walls with ladders.
You were safe because the geographical position itself was completely untouchable. That is the kind of security God provides.
And notice how David uses the word my repeatedly. My goodness, my fortress, my high tower.
It is a radical, aggressive appropriation of the Almighty.
Yeah, he is taking the infinite, transcendent creator of the universe and claiming him as a personal, covenantal possession.
That repetitive claim of my is the pulse of genuine faith. It is a desperate clinging to reality. David knows he is absolutely nothing without that specific rock.
And that realization forces a harsh transition in the text.
It does. When a person genuinely recognizes God as the absolute sovereign source of all might and views him as an untouchable high tower, it inevitably forces them to evaluate the human being hiding behind the walls.
Right. If God is the colossal fortress, what on earth is the creature taking shelter inside?
The contrast is jarring, to say the least.
Once the sheer magnitude of the sovereign God comes into focus, the fleeting insignificance of humanity becomes impossible to ignore.
That takes us into verses 3 and 4, where David asks, Lord, what is man that thou takest knowledge of him?
We are staring across a massive chasm between the infinite creator who subdues entire nations and the total frailty of the human creature.
Spurgeon highlights a linguistic nuance here that lands like a punch. The Hebrew text essentially says Adam is as Abel.
Adam being the representative term for all of mankind.
Right, and Abel literally translates to vanity or breath.
And the concept of vanity here is crucial to grasp. It does not refer to vanity in our modern colloquial sense of being obsessed with your appearance.
No, not at all. It does not mean staring in a mirror. In this context, it means vapor. It signifies an unsubstantial, completely empty thing.
What's fascinating here is the visual from a Dutch painting in Amsterdam that the source text brings up to illustrate this.
Oh, the one with the bladder, yes.
Yeah, it depicts a man carrying a massive blown-up bladder on his shoulders, strutting around, while another man stands right next to him.
Quietly holding a pin, just ready to prick the bladder.
It is a hilarious but terrifying way to view the human ego. That is the biblical view of human existence without God.
It is a passing shadow. It is a mirage constantly on the verge of melting back into absolute nothingness.
You have this guy walking around with a literal balloon on his back, completely inflated with his own self-worth.
His career plans, his 5-year goals, his wealth.
Meanwhile, mortality is just standing right behind him with a needle. You might be thinking, if I am just a vapor, a bubble waiting to pop, why should I even try?
Right. Does recognizing our own total vanity just lead to depression and nihilism?
Or does it do something else entirely? Because if we are just a puff of air, it seems entirely absurd that the creator of the cosmos would ever look in our direction.
It would be completely absurd if not for the electing love of God.
Yeah, the theologian Gregory Nazianzen uses a brilliant analogy to explain this.
The analogy of the great sultan. Imagine the most supreme, unapproachable ruler on earth taking specific, intimate notice of a lowly, insignificant tankard bearer.
A water carrier. The water carrier would be completely overwhelmed by the unmerited favor.
Now, take that vast disproportion and multiply it to infinity. The realization of our absolute nothingness does not depress the believer.
Instead, it magnifies the glory of divine condescension.
Yes. God's knowledge of us is not a passive clinical awareness that we happen to exist on a spinning rock.
It is the deliberate, electing love.
Yeah.
He stoops down to care for a creature that is fundamentally incapable of offering anything of value in return.
That is the core of the matter. We are Adam as Abel. We are completely helpless vapors.
And because man is so helpless and fleeting, he absolutely cannot rely on his own frail nature to fight his battles.
When a vapor is faced with foes that are stronger and vastly more deceitful, the vapor has no choice but to call on the terrifying, majestic intervention of the Creator.
And that brings us to a massive shift in the text, where David basically calls down the artillery of heaven.
The language in verses 5 through 8 becomes heavily apocalyptic.
He prays, "Bow thy heavens, O Lord, and come down. Touch the mountains, and they shall smoke."
He is pleading for God to bring the overwhelming reality of heaven crashing into the earthly sphere.
In the ancient mindset, mountains were viewed as the most permanent, unshakable structures in existence.
They were the immovable anchors of the earth. But David knows that at the mere touch of God's finger, those massive peaks will instantly ignite and turn to smoke.
It is a vivid, terrifying picture of what happens when divine wrath meets human opposition.
He also cries out, "Cast forth lightning and scatter them."
And the literal Hebrew behind that phrase is wild. It translates to lighten lightning.
Yes, lightning. It's essentially saying, unleash the very core essence of the storm.
He wants God to shoot divine arrows and completely rout the enemy. But here is where it gets really interesting.
The twist regarding the specific nature of the threat.
Yeah, when you look closely at the enemies David is facing, they're not just massive armies with swords and chariots.
Their defining characteristic is that they are fundamentally deceptive.
Right. Verse 8 describes them as men whose mouth speaketh vanity, and their right hand is a right hand of falsehood.
That specific phrase, a right hand of falsehood, is heavily laden with historical meaning.
In the ancient world, offering the right hand was a solemn, legally binding pledge of good faith.
The Roman orator Cicero actually wrote about the right hand as the ultimate witness of trust among men.
When you shook someone's right hand, you were binding yourself to truth. You were making a covenant of honesty.
But these enemies possess a right hand of falsehood. Their very act of making a promise is a weaponized lie.
Their deception is dexterous. They are experts at perjury. How do you even fight that?
It is an incredibly frustrating scenario.
Think about it. If you are a believer, fighting an enemy whose handshake is a lie is like trying to fight smoke.
You cannot parry a lie with a physical sword.
You cannot build a stone wall to protect yourself against slander.
Exactly. If the environment around you is completely polluted with deceit, your physical skill, your logic, your carefully crafted arguments are entirely useless.
You are completely unable to fix the situation yourself.
And that total inability is precisely why David has to rely on the lightning of God.
Human courts, human logic, and human diplomacy all fail catastrophically when the opponent's core nature is deceit.
It is also why David repeats his urgent prayer in this psalm. In verses 7 and 11, he cries out, "Rid me and deliver me."
Sometimes modern readers assume that repeating a prayer shows a lack of faith, like you are trying to nag God into action.
But here, it is not a vain repetition. It is an urgent, desperate plea prompted by imminent danger.
And the suffocating, toxic environment of these strange children.
Right. These are people who are completely alien to God's covenant. They operate on a different moral frequency entirely.
David knows that when God finally lays his hand on these boastful, lying men, they will be consumed just like that smoking mountain.
Deliverance from these false right-handed liars is critical, but the deliverance is not an end in itself.
God does not just rescue his people to leave them standing around in a vacuum.
Clearing the static of all that deceit creates the necessary silence for the believer to tune their instruments for an entirely new purpose.
Once the smoke clears, an active response fills the void. The text introduces the idea of a new song, bringing us to verses 9 and 10.
The transition from the chaotic noise of battle and the static of lies to the organized harmony of music is so striking.
David vows to sing a new song upon a psaltery and an instrument of 10 strings.
Historically, this 10-stringed instrument is known as the nebulizer. Let us pause and look at what that actually was.
Yeah, it was a portable harp, usually crafted from fir wood.
Or sometimes almug wood, which was a highly prized type of red sandalwood imported from India.
Playing this physical instrument required immense disciplined skill, which directly links back to the opening verse about God teaching the fingers to move.
That detail connects everything beautifully. True praise requires both the hand and the tongue working together in truthful harmony.
Think about the massive contrast here. The enemies had hands of falsehood and mouths of vanity.
Their physical gestures and their spoken words were perfectly united in deceit.
But the believer uses their physical hands on a 10-stringed harp and their tongue in song to unite in absolute truth and gratitude.
It is the exact opposite of the enemy's posture.
But I want to push back on a specific phrase David uses here because it feels counterintuitive.
Okay, what is the phrase?
In verse 10, he says, "It is he that giveth salvation unto kings," and he talks about being delivered from the hurtful sword.
Yeah,
Let us be realistic. David was a literal monarch.
true. He commanded vast armies.
He had chariots, he had brilliant generals, he had fortified cities. I struggle with this. If you work 60 hours a week to build a business, or you spend years organizing an army,
It feels incredibly dismissive of human effort to attribute the survival or the success entirely to divine intervention.
exactly. How do we reconcile the swinging of the human sword with the claim that God did the saving? What does this mean for you, the listener today, who is managing your own daily battles, not a nation?
This raises an important question, and that tension is precisely where the theology of human inability meets daily life.
The source material provides a brilliant quote from the King of Aragon to address this.
Yes, he noted, "Victories are not gotten by art or subtlety, but given of God."
If a king who possesses every conceivable earthly advantage, massive wealth, impenetrable armor, tens of thousands of trained troops,
Must acknowledge that his salvation from the sword is a direct unilateral act of divine intervention, then it completely strips away all human pride.
the resources do not generate the victory. They are simply the tools God ordains to use.
For you listening today, this means that whatever resources you have amassed, your savings accounts, your advanced degrees, your professional network,
Those things are completely incapable of saving you on their own. Your reliance must be as utter and complete as David's.
it levels the playing field completely. The powerful monarch with a standing army and the peasant with nothing are in the exact same position before the sovereignty of God.
Totally dependent. And when a leader, whether a king, a CEO, a father, or a mother, experiences this kind of divine salvation and rightly acknowledges it, the benefits do not stop with them.
The blessing cascades outward. It waters the roots of the entire surrounding society.
And that shifts our focus to verses 12 through 14, where we see the structural architecture of a blessed society.
The linguistic shift in this section is very telling. Throughout the entire first part of the text, David uses the singular pronoun.
Right, my strength, my fortress, my hands.
But once the deliverance from deceit is secured and the new song is sung, the language broadens to the plural.
Our sons, our daughters, our garners. True covenant blessing is never meant to remain isolated.
It naturally creates a flourishing, interdependent community. Let us look at the specific blessings listed here because the imagery is incredibly detailed.
Starting with the sons, David prays that our sons may be as plants grown up in their youth.
He is talking about young men who are vigorous, straight, and strong.
They are not stunted, they are not dwarfed by their environment, they have deep roots, and they grow to their full potential.
And the imagery used for the daughters is equally striking and carries massive cultural weight.
He prays that the daughters may be as cornerstones, polished after the similitude of a palace.
To understand this, we have to look at ancient Grecian architecture.
Right, you frequently saw caryatids. These were magnificent pillars carved in the shape of women.
Supporting the massive, crushing weight of the building's entablatures. The daughters are seen as the unifying strength and the polished grace of the family structure.
They are load-bearing pillars of the society.
The text points out how this divine value placed on female children stood in stark, radical opposition to the practices of the surrounding heathen nations.
Those pagan cultures frequently discarded, ignored, or severely devalued their daughters.
God's covenant elevates them, polishing them like palace stones, placing them at the structural center of a flourishing society.
That distinction highlights how alien the covenant community looks compared to the world around it.
The blessing also extends massively into the economy. The text describes garners, or storehouses, being full of all manner of store.
It mentions sheep bringing forth thousands and 10,000s in the streets. We are talking about staggering, overwhelming agrarian wealth.
The source references Job, who possessed 14,000 sheep after his restoration.
And Mesha, the king of Moab, who paid a massive tribute of 100,000 lambs.
The oxen are described as strong to labor, or literally translated, loaded with flesh.
Meaning they are exceptionally well-fed and capable of pulling massive weight.
All of this incredible economic and familial flourishing is wrapped in an atmosphere of total, unbroken peace.
Verse 14 says, that there be no breaking in nor going out.
In our modern context, we might just think of a burglar alarm.
But historically, this meant no marauding armies were invading the city walls, and no citizens were being forced into exile.
In the ancient world, conquerors like the Assyrian king Sennacherib were notorious for their barbaric practice of forcibly deporting entire populations.
Dragging them away from their homelands to distant, hostile territories. David is praying for a society completely free from that specific terror.
Furthermore, he prays there will be no complaining in our streets.
The literal translation implies no public riot, no collective cry of sorrow, no secret festering dissatisfaction that boils over into rebellion.
So, what does this all mean? We do not live in an agrarian society where we count our wealth by checking how much flesh is on our oxen.
Or how many sheep are in the street. But the underlying principle translates perfectly into a modern understanding of holistic peace.
We are looking at a vision of stable homes where children grow up strong and inherently valued.
We are looking at economic security where families have surplus in their storehouses.
We are looking at cities that are entirely free from the terror of violent home invasions and the anguish of public riot.
It is a picture of total, comprehensive societal health.
The 17th century theologian Richard Holdsworth called this specific state the vein of civil happiness.
It proves unequivocally that God cares immensely about the physical, temporal realities of his people.
The material world is not an evil illusion to be escaped. It is a physical reality created by God, and it is meant to flourish under his active blessing.
But as beautiful as this picture of agricultural and social harmony is, stopping here would be a fatal mistake.
It is so incredibly easy to read those verses, look at a healthy 401k, a secure home, and a thriving family, and conclude, I have arrived, this is the ultimate goal.
But the psalmist recognizes the lethal danger in that specific line of thinking. He introduces a massive paradigm-shifting correction in the final verse.
Verse 15, it reads, happy is that people, that is in such a case. Yeah, happy is that people whose God is the Lord.
At first glance, reading it quickly, it looks like a simple, happy continuation of the previous thoughts.
But there is a massive theological pivot happening right on the word yea. That word functions as a comparative revocation.
It literally means yea, rather.
The psalmist is effectively saying, yes, a people with full barns, strong children, and safe streets is happy, but rather, the true overriding happiness belongs only to the people whose God is the Lord.
Furthermore, the text uses a literary device called ingemination.
Right. Ingemination is the deliberate repetition of a word for intense emphasis.
By repeating the word happy, the text forces the reader to contrast the lesser temporal happiness of full barns with the supreme eternal happiness of possessing God himself.
That is the turning point of the entire text. It is the stark, terrifying difference between clinging desperately to the gifts and actually possessing the giver.
You could have the strongest oxen, the fullest bank accounts, the most polished cornerstones, and the safest streets on earth.
But if you do not have the Lord, you have absolutely nothing of lasting value.
The poet John Donne captured this dynamic brilliantly. He said that possessing temporal blessings without spiritual blessings is like holding counterfeit evidences to a property you do not actually own. You might look at the fake deed, admire the calligraphy, and feel incredibly secure in your wealth.
But when the time comes to actually claim the land, you will be thrown out into the cold.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at the specific name used for God in this final verse.
The text says, whose God is Jehovah.
It does not just use a generic, vague word for a higher power. Jehovah is the specific name that signifies absolute independency.
He is the great I am.
And it is the name most fiercely tied to his covenant faithfulness. Having Jehovah as your God is the only absolute insurance of happiness.
Because he is the literal only thing in existence that cannot be lost, stolen, or subjected to decay.
The secular world evaluates happiness entirely by looking at the quisic, which is Latin for in such a case.
They look at the external circumstances. But the believer looks to the cui dominus, whose God is the Lord. The secular world is entirely obsessed with the quisic. We constantly measure our lives by in such a case.
Am I in the case of having a high-paying job? Am I in the case of having a perfectly healthy body?
We check our portfolio to see if our retirement is secure. We tie our entire emotional stability to whether or not we are in such a case.
But the biblical framework entirely rejects that as the final measure of joy. True happiness is found solely in the cui dominus.
We have traced a massive theological arc today.
We started by recognizing God as the absolute sovereign source of our strength, the rock who physically teaches our very fingers to fight.
We looked at the terrifying vapor of our own existence and how that absolute nothingness magnifies God's electing love.
We heard the desperate cry for deliverance from the suffocating dexterous deceit of strange children.
We saw how that specific deliverance clears the static, allowing the believer to tune a 10-stringed lute for a new song of truth.
And finally, we saw that while God actively blesses societies with temporal peace, true happiness rests entirely in possessing Jehovah.
It presents a comprehensive view of reality where man is entirely dependent and God is entirely sovereign.
Actively orchestrating everything, from the physical strength of a warrior's hand to the architectural peace of a nation's streets.
It is a stunning realization.
I want to leave you with one final, striking idea drawn directly from the structure of the source text.
This is a fascinating detail.
Scholars, including Lord Congleton, have pointed out something incredible about the architecture of the Book of Psalms.
Psalm 144 is the very last prayer of petition from Jehovah's Anointed in the entire book.
After this psalm, there are 6 psalms remaining. And those final 6 psalms contain absolutely no requests.
There is no more crying out for physical deliverance.
No more asking for military strength. No more pleading for daily bread or safe streets.
They're only pure high hallelujahs.
I want you to ponder this. What if the goal of all our spiritual wrestling are desperate cries for deliverance from liars?
And our deep desire for earthly stability.
What if the goal is to finally exhaust our need to ask God for anything at all?
Leaving us with absolutely nothing left to do but spend eternity in pure, unadulterated praise.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep your eyes fixed on the giver rather than the gifts.